Hey everyone, welcome to Localized. We are so excited to be here today. We are joined by Matt Kohut and Dan LeClair, and today we're going to be talking about why people skills matter. It's a really exciting topic. I think both Dan and Matt have a lot to share around why people skills in the workplace, collaboration, teamwork, team efforts, project management are going to be so critical for you to be able to work in industries that you're interested in. Matt actually is the co-author of The Smart Mission, NASA's Lessons for Managing Knowledge, People, and Projects. He has been on Localized before, so you may recognize him as an expert in speaking, communications. And Dan LeClair is the CEO of GBSN, the Global Business School Network. He is going to explore learning collaboration and teamwork with Matt. He has quite a bit of experience in the space as the Executive Vice President of the AACSB International. And we are very happy to be joined today by both of you to have this conversation. So thank you, Dan. Thank you, Matt. And if you want to start with a brief introduction around both of you, that would be great.
Great. Why don't I start, since I'm playing more of a facilitator moderator role, but I'm happy to contribute as we go. But why don't I start by just adding my welcome to everyone who's joined us. It's a pleasure to host this conversation with Matt Kohut and do it on the Localized platform. Localized has been doing great work connecting emerging leaders with experienced professionals, experts, and to jobs all over the world. So we're quite excited about the work that we do with Localized, and I'm happy to be here hosting this conversation. I'm Dan LeClair. The Global Business School Network, which I have the privilege of leading, is a group of about 140 business schools in a little more than 50 countries working together to essentially foster economic and social development, especially in the developing world. We believe that management skills are not only important for careers and for organizational performance, but we believe they're important drivers of economic and social development. They're important to building more inclusive and sustainable communities. So we're happy to be here with this conversation. Hello, Matt. Thanks for joining us today. I want to say that we're going to have plenty of opportunity to get to know you, Matt, but I want to point out you're the managing partner of K&P Communications and co-author of Smart Mission, which I have had the pleasure of reading, completing only just yesterday. I completed, and what a great book. I was happy to feel like it resonated throughout the reading experience. So, but you also authored a book called Compelling People, Hidden Qualities That Make Us Influential. And both books, I'm sure, have been quite important and well read. But I've seen you describe yourself, Matt, as a speaker coach. And right. I'm wondering if we could just start with a little bit of a discussion around what that means, because I think ultimately there's some parallels to our conversation today. What does that mean in just a sentence or two?
Well, thanks, Dan. And yeah, I'm Matt Kohut, and I run a firm that's actually dedicated to helping people be more effective communicators. We like to say we take good people and try to make them great communicators. And speaker coach essentially means helping people be as good at communicating their ideas as they are at generating those ideas. A lot of people are wonderful at their thinking, their analytical work, even their relationship building. But when it comes to actually figuring out how to say what's going to be most effective, most persuasive, most influential, that's where we can add some value. And I come to this work from having been a speechwriter. And when I was speech writing, I had a couple of friends, and the three of us were looking at good speakers and speakers who were less effective. And we were trying to figure out, is there a secret sauce to this? And that led us on a little bit of a journey into both social science and practice. And it led to the creation of the firm that you mentioned that does speaker coaching. And that was the basis for the book, Compelling People, that you mentioned.
Right. Wow. Well, it's not, I think as you might say, it's not just what you say, but it's how you say it, right? And
that's right.
And I need to tell you, it makes me a little bit anxious, a little bit to be talking with a person that coaches people for a living. I hope you won't mind giving me some feedback after the session.
You're doing great. So it's going to be a short conversation.
Well, okay, feedback during the session. I appreciate it very much. Well, like I said, I did read Smart Mission. And again, it resonated. In fact, there's some parallels, I think, between what you do, obviously, as a professional. And you might expect this since you're a co-author on the book with Ed Hoffman and Larry Pruzak. But, the parallel seems to me that basically my understanding of the book Smart Mission is that technical skills are important. Right. But when it comes to projects, and not only projects, I think, but especially large and complex projects, these technical skills are not very valuable without people skills, right? Both in terms of how we think about managing vis-a-vis those technical skills, but what engineers and others bring to the table in terms of their own people skills. So this is my interpretation. Does that sound about right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you're spot on. And the book draws in large part from experience that the three co-authors had together at NASA. Ed, Larry, and I all worked with NASA. Ed was the first chief knowledge officer at NASA. And prior to that, he was in charge of all professional development for project managers and engineers at NASA for many years. So NASA is a renowned organization as far as what they've done in space exploration, and knowing all the science and technical things that NASA engineers do is incredibly impressive on its own. And yet there are plenty of examples over the years where organizations like NASA have had all the technical expertise they needed, but when people couldn't work effectively together, projects failed. And there have been high visibility examples of this, and then less so. And I think that when the three of us were thinking about sharing work we'd done from over about a 15-year period, we were having conversations about, this work around how people learn, how they collaborate, how they work effectively in teams, how organizational culture supports that. These things are largely intangible. They're not easy to measure. They're hard to put into key performance indicators, and yet they play such a huge part in whether we succeed or not. And so we tried to wrap our arms around that and identify some of these, what we call 6 intangibles, that can lead to mission success or project success or product success. And like I said, they're hard to measure. And what we tried to offer was a bit of a qualitative framework and some guiding questions for thinking about whether the approach that you're taking has opportunities for growth.
Yeah, the way I understood this is at the center of all of that, at the center of NASA, is this idea that we call knowledge, right? This thing called knowledge. And, you can't talk about human skills without talking about knowledge. You can't talk about technical skills without talking about knowledge, but yet it's not well understood, right? And I think that's sort of a launching point for some of this discussion. So I thought we'd start with that question. What is knowledge, Matt?
Right. Yeah. Small question. Right. Yeah. And, you mentioned my colleague, Larry Pruzak, and he is literally one of the world's foremost authorities on this idea of knowledge in organizations. I would submit he's also probably one of the foremost authorities on just what knowledge is, period. But the focus really on what it means for those of us at work is really important. And if you want to think of a way to define it a little more narrowly, what we're talking about is your know-how, the things you know how to do in a practical sense that allow you to get things done. So we're not talking about all the trivia, It's not the what you know, it's the how. And that know-how is ultimately what allows you to make things happen in an organization. Now, the funny thing about knowledge is it's incredibly social because we share it with each other. There's very little that you know yourself. Most of what you know, almost, I would hesitate to say all of it, you learn from other people in one way or another. If you read it in a book, if you learned it from a website, at some point it came from somewhere else. Now, every now and then you have a eureka moment and you have an insight based on something, but it's building on things you already knew. So knowledge is incredibly social, and people share it in ways that are very informal, as well as more formal ways, such as writing things down or recording a meeting or something like that. So it's a tricky topic. And one way to think about it, I'll just give you the one big distinction that a lot of people make around knowledge is if you can write it down, give people a recipe or a how-to list, that's sometimes called tacit knowledge. That's relatively speaking the easy stuff. And if you can codify something like that, then other people can replicate it and can scale it. That's why that's incredibly important. The kind of knowledge that's trickier to think about is, or sorry, that's explicit knowledge. My mistake. That's explicit knowledge. You can put it down explicitly. The trickier kind is what's called tacit knowledge. And tacit knowledge is what's between your ears. And people who have a lot of tacit knowledge, it often comes from experience as well as education. And it's hard to give to someone else. So to think about this in terms that might be easy to understand, think about if you were talking to a concert violinist and you said, well, how do you play the violin like that? And they would say, well, practice, practice, practice. But what that really means is they have a lot of knowledge about playing the violin that they can't just give you. They can tell another violinist, well, maybe change this about the way you hold your bow, or try doing this or try doing that. But it's the kind of knowledge that requires some formal learning, some experience, and some combination thereof. And it's very slippery. It's not something that you can articulate perfectly. So when you think about what knowledge is, this combination of explicit and tacit is challenging. And generally, organizations are trying to drive the stuff that's between your ears into those more explicit frameworks that are repeatable, because that's what makes an organization scale, which is when the thing that you know can be shared with thousands of other people. But inevitably, there are things that people know that are harder to share in that respect. And that's where personal expertise comes into play.
Right. And this is becoming increasingly important for organizations, right? It's this ability to take what's between the ears, as you describe it, and convert that into something that's useful for others in the organization and creating value. I wrote a quote down as I was reading the book. I don't always write these things down, but I wrote a quote from Larry, one of your co-authors, who was pressed about to define knowledge. And he says, let's say you plan to make a fine dinner for some good friends. I may be getting it a little off, right? The letters printed on the recipe are data. The recipe is information, and knowledge is the ability to cook. Right. Is what he said. But then he went on, he said, wisdom is marrying a good cook. Is what he said.
That's right.
It's a step above knowledge. For me, that was really a good way of crystallizing some of those differences. And, when we think about knowledge and those things that you use to describe knowledge, it's intangible, right? In some sense, right? And as a consequence, it's difficult to share. There's no unit of measurement, and there's difficult to share. But one thing that we do know, I think, is that experience is one way that we develop knowledge, right?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. But as I think it was noted in the book, experience may be the best teacher, but it's not a particularly good teacher, right?
Right.
So how do you,
James March said that.
Because we have our participants I think many of them are learners, right? So they're going through this experience where they're learning and developing. But how does one take experience and convert that into knowledge?
Well, I think that one way to consider this is to be intentional about reflecting on experience. It's one thing to have experiences, and it's another to learn from them. And I think that, well, you can think about people who do the same thing over and over and they don't get any better at it. So again, you can have many hours of experience that don't necessarily lead to knowledge if you keep making the same mistake over and over. And so that reflection is the really important part of this. And that's not to say that everything we do, we immediately succeed at either, but the idea that you're going to do something, then have some sort of after action reflection, think, what did I did? What went right here? What could I try doing differently? That's what really leads to knowledge, is experience plus reflection. So I think that when you're considering your own knowledge base and thinking, how can I build knowledge, being really deliberate about time for reflection with yourself is important. You might end up having to do this time for reflection on your own time, depending on the fast pace of your work day. But I do think it's the difference between people who accrue a lot of knowledge and people who just take what's put in front of them.
What role does failure play in this sort of knowledge building, this self-knowledge building through experience?
Well, you never want to let a good failure go to waste. I think failure, I think it's a tremendous learning experience. If everything comes easily to you, you're not going to learn anything because you're not going to challenge your own assumptions. So we have to fail to learn. Now, that doesn't make it particularly fun, but it's actually where we have to start to actually build new knowledge. We try what seems like the evident path first, and it doesn't work. And then we say, okay, that didn't work. What other opportunities are open to us? And then we look for either new ideas or people who have different approaches, and we try again. And so I think that to the point you just made about failure, that's where the after action part comes in. If something doesn't go right, it's incumbent on you to do that after action reflection and say, okay, that didn't work. And it could work terribly or just be a mild misfire. But in either case, you still want to be able to learn from that.
Well, you've started us on this journey about this social dimension, right? So individually, there are things that when you think about the context of an individual in an organization, there are things that the organization, that managers can do to facilitate learning, right? In the book, you talk about Google, right? And the 20% experiment that they ran, right? And giving time, right? You talk about psychological distance or psychological comfort, I guess the safety, psychological safety, and creating that safety for people to make mistakes and to learn from them. So if we start talking about this set of things that organizations, that managers can do, you begin to understand it's a lot about people, right? Right. And those human.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And letting people know that they're expected to push and expected to make mistakes is an important part of that. You mentioned psychological safety a moment ago, and psychological safety speaks to the idea that on a team, everyone can express their thoughts about the work that's being done without fear of retribution or getting shut down. And this is a really, really powerful thing. It's been validated time and time again since the initial work was done by a team led by Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School in the mid-1990s. Google ran a giant study of its teams, its project teams back in the mid-2010s, and figured out that this idea that people felt comfortable with the people they worked with, that they took turns in conversation, they listened to each other, they spoke respectfully. That was the thing that distinguished their most effective teams from their less effective teams. It wasn't how many PhDs there were per team. It was about the way people agreed to interact with each other. And this doesn't mean people weren't held accountable for things or that they didn't disagree with each other. They did so civilly and in an air of mutual respect, and they elicited opinions from each other. And so would say that one way to do this is to always be asking the question, what am I missing here? What could I be doing differently? Is there something that I'm overlooking? And being relentlessly questioning of yourself sets an attitude that tells other people, hey, I'm open. And if you show that kind of openness, it can create a reciprocity effect where other people will do the same in turn.
Well, I think that's important. And in the book, you explored some examples in the context of NASA. Tell me about this psychological safety and this opportunity to share in the context of NASA. And in particular, you mentioned early in this conversation, there were some pretty important failures in the context of NASA. And how did these concepts fit into those failures?
Yeah, I'll give you two examples from the space shuttle program that NASA ran from the early 1980s through 2010. In 1986, NASA suffered a very high-profile failure of a space shuttle called Challenger. The shuttle launched and it exploded on about 80 seconds into launch, something like that. And the lives of the crew were lost immediately. And it was a real tragedy, and it absolutely shook NASA profoundly to its core. And the specifics of what happened that day remain one of the most foundational learning experiences in NASA's history as an organization. And essentially, I'll summarize, it was a abnormally cold day in Florida, which is a pretty warm place. And there was ice and cold weather that was potentially going to change one of the materials that was used to make part of the space shuttle. I'm just summarizing. It was a little rubber seal that was going to behave differently in cold weather than it would have in warmer weather. And people were raising these questions the night before in engineering teleconferences about this. And the dialogue that happened in those meetings shut down discussion. People said, we heard from you, go sit down, essentially. And there was a lack of psychological safety. People did speak up, and they were their inputs were essentially discounted. And I'm summarizing, but I think that there's a lot of literature that will tell this story in much better detail. And the shuttle launched into this weather that concerned so many people, given this specific technical challenge, and lives were lost. And it really provoked a huge period of soul searching in NASA. It didn't immediately shake out. It took many years. NASA began flying the space shuttle after some time and had many successful missions, and that had another failure in 2003, where some of the dynamics were very similar, where people raised concerns and those concerns were dismissed. And after that second failure, there was, I would say, a wholesale change after some time at NASA. Again, a period of soul searching and a real determination from a new generation of leaders to say, you know what, we can do differently here. And what happened was that the generation that had grown up in the wake of that first accident, the Challenger accident, had seen what had happened and decided that there was a different way to lead. And so in that last 5-6 years of the space shuttle program, the tone in which big reviews before launches were conducted was very different. And in the book, we talk about a different example that happened in 2009, where a concern was raised about a mission, and it was on a tight time frame. There were a lot of things that were pushing people to try and make a launch decision quickly. And people in NASA's engineering and safety community said, you know what, we don't understand this well enough yet. We can't vote yes to launch this thing now. They were voting what NASA says is no go for launch. And they voted no go the first time people wanted to launch, and people went off and did more engineering work. And they've came back a second time and they voted no go again while all this engineering work was going on, because they didn't feel like they understood the technical problem. Well, all this engineering work was going on across 10 different centers with 1,000 people working on it. And it turned out that somebody was doing some work that was really important that actually enabled them to solve the problem while these meetings were happening and this dissenting opinion process was working itself out. Sure enough, that work did reveal a technique that could be used to look at this technical problem, understand the complexity of what the issue was, and assess the risk in a way that the technical and safety communities at NASA felt was legitimate. And they had a third meeting and said, you know what, we get it now. We're go for launch. And this shuttle mission launched successfully, and they all lived happily ever after, so to speak. And just as important as the outcome here was something that one of the engineers who worked on this said to the chief engineer of NASA at the time, after one of these no-go votes. She said, that was a hard day, but it felt a lot better than it used to feel. And
Right.
there was a fundamental difference in the culture that people were experiencing that was in some way just as important as the output. The process was different.
And that's the point, right? That's where we started with this conversation, right? This is technical knowledge is important, right? But unless we create the environment in which that technical knowledge becomes useful to others in making decisions, then we're not really doing the kinds of things we need to do, especially for these mission critical kinds of opportunities. I think that's perfect. But I want to get at something that you've sort of hinted at. This, we talked about knowledge, and then we moved into learning, right? And and I think that's really part of the main point here is how do we convert that knowledge into something that we can all learn from. And in the book and in the NASA experience, storytelling became important. Tell us about storytelling in the context of NASA and what it means in terms of what we call human skills.
I'm so glad you asked this, because when you say storytelling to people and you mention NASA, a lot of people think, what are you talking about? All these engineers and they're telling stories. What does this mean? And I will tell you that when this idea of using stories to share ideas and knowledge was first broached at NASA, the engineers were so suspicious that my colleague Ed Hoffman and Larry Pruzak, they didn't even call them storytelling. They said, we want you to share your experience or something to that effect. But the idea was that people know a lot of things. And if you just ask them, so what happened? They will tell you a story. And if you tell them, don't bring any PowerPoint slides, just show up and tell us what happened, people have a lot to say. And one thing I really admire about the kind of subject matter experts that you meet at an organization like NASA is they love what they do. And if you say, tell me about this, I don't know, this mechanical system, they'll tell you about it in all kinds of detail. And so what Ed and Larry and others did was they started having events where they were getting people away from the idea of having PowerPoint slides and presentations that were really pro forma and frankly boring. And they would put people in a setting where they would say, show up, you don't have to wear a tie, bring no PowerPoint slides, and just share a little bit about the story of your project or tell us about your project. And people turned out to really like this because it broke up what was thought to be something that would be a little dreary into something that where people would engage with and that would build dialogue. And this was very quickly very successful and people enjoyed it. People also found that they could write their stories like this, where you just said, hey, tell us the story of how this succeeded, or tell us what happened when this failed and how you fixed it. And it created a culture where people thought, I can tell people about my mistakes because this is okay. And over time, NASA sponsored this series of knowledge forums. We called some of them Masters with Masters, and we called some of them knowledge forums. We had all sorts of names for these different events, and people got really comfortable talking about what they did. And it created some of this openness that I think contributed to that culture I mentioned earlier around this space shuttle decision, where people had the courage to say, you know what, we're not ready, no go for launch. I think because people were practiced at this, it helped to inform that kind of thinking and behavior.
You used the word culture in that discussion. And, you know, when you think about your story or your set of stories about NASA, this idea of cultural change becomes important. And you talked initially about explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge, right? And I think this is the sort of the key when it comes to culture. Culture is more like tacit knowledge, right? It's implicit. It's a shared set of expectations and not written down. So how important is culture in understanding how we manage vis-a-vis knowledge and this technical expertise?
Well, how important is culture? Peter Drucker said, culture eats knowledge, eats strategy for breakfast. It's that important. Culture is everything in the sense that it's the air we breathe, essentially, in an organization. And if the culture allows people to feel like they have permission to do what they need to do, then they're going to feel empowered. And conversely, if the culture makes people feel like they may be shut down or they have to operate within silos or very narrowly have to behave in certain ways, then the culture can inhibit innovation and the kind of risk-taking that needs to happen for people to problem solve in ways that are unique and in some way to the moment of any specific challenge. So one way to think about culture, it's such a big topic, is what are the signals and what are the incentives that a culture gives? So if you look at your organization, you look at who gets hired, who gets promoted. Those are signals that tell you something about the culture. So if the person who gets promoted is a person who welcomes dialogue as a leader and is inclusive, that's a signal about the culture. And vice versa, if a person who gets promoted is a self-promoter, if they're all about their own accomplishments and not so much about those of other people, that tells you something about the culture as well. So one way to think about culture is what signals is it sending to you? And what incentives do you have to behave one way or another? Is competition something that the culture tries to promote? Is collaboration something that the culture tries to promote? In some places, people get bonuses for competing against each other. In other places, people are expected to collaborate with each other, and they're given all kinds of tools and expectations and benchmarks for doing that. So I think that those are the kinds of things I mean by signals and incentives. And rather than trying to think, well, is our culture open, closed? Those are good questions. I think that signals and incentives give you almost an economic lens that you can bring to thinking about culture. And it can be a little easier to start to identify what kind of a culture do we have based on the signals and incentives we see.
Yeah, and connecting those dots, right? You mentioned the collaborative culture and the competitive culture. Most are in between, right? Somewhere in between. You look at those extremes, which one is logically more likely to encourage people to share knowledge, right? Their experience, right? We talked about developing experience or knowledge through experience, but in the competitive culture, we are more likely to hoard that, right?
Exactly.
In the collaborative culture, we're more likely to share it. So, you know, thinking about those pieces and how they fit together, really, I think is what makes this book, in your experience, so exciting. I want to, before we leave that subject, though, because there was something in there that I think is particularly important for learners today. I hear often from schools that we work with that students today are very purpose-driven, right? And there's this line in there where there's some scientists working on a particular problem. I won't say what that is yet, but working on a particular problem. And the question they were posed is, you know, do you trust each other in this world of science and things like that? And the response was, of course we trust each other. We're trying to cure cancer, right? And this idea that purpose is really what brings us together is pretty important. So, you know, you look at culture, And part of that culture is about purpose, right? What other signals? What other signals besides collaboration and competition, purpose? What other signals can students look for the kinds of organizations they'd like to work for?
That's a great question. And I'm glad you mentioned purpose because it is something that shapes a culture. So in some way, you can be both collaborative or competitive and have a purpose-driven organization. And that's actually an interesting, so almost third leg of a triangle there, as opposed to something that sits in a continuum between collaboration and competition. I think that to a certain extent, what you're looking for when you're trying to consider what the culture is the extent to which people are comfortable telling you what they do and sharing their expertise with you. Just even in simple conversations with people, you can get an idea about formality or informality, openness, or an extent to which people keep their cards close to the vest, as they say, or are a little guarded in their communication. I think formality, sometimes you'll see that in written communication. You'll see it in email communication, for instance. Even the style in which people communicate, I think, will tell you something about culture. I'll give you a very simple example. I work with a very big financial institution that has a very prescribed way of writing emails. And their emails start with the answer rather than the question. And this is sometimes called the bottom line up front. And that's a cultural dimension of the way they communicate. And you don't start by saying, so here's the problem and giving people a whole bunch of context. You say, here's the answer. Here's why we think it's the answer. Here's a little bit of information about that answer. And it's a very crisp and concise way of communicating. And it's just an example of a way of determining culture. So when you're looking at culture, even as an outsider, and let's say you're interviewing, you'll pick up on these things, even in emails, even in preliminary phone calls with people. The way they communicate can be very different, and it can tell you a lot about culture.
And you got that, everyone, that even if you're a scientist, a technical expert, looking at that softer side, if you will, that human side of an organization and culture is really, really important. Now, teams, we all work in teams, right? And there's this neat statement you and your co-authors make in this book that I never really thought about, that when asked about high-performing teams, about successful teams, the words were, great teams are heard more easily than they are seen. What's that mean?
Yeah, my colleague Ed Hoffman likes to say great teams are noisy. And what he means by that is great teams don't necessarily agree all the time. They have robust and sometimes even rambunctious dialogue with each other. And they're happy doing that. And there's a chatter to them where they go back and forth about ideas. And look, let's acknowledge that in a tech organization, this might be rambunctious on Slack. It might not be literally out loud. Everybody might be working from home, but there might be that kind of freewheeling rambunctiousness in the way people communicate in their Slack channels with each other, where they're open with each other and they push back on each other's ideas, and they do so both respectfully and good-naturedly. And that's what that means about teams being noisy. I think when you sense that an office is too quiet and that people are behaving as though they're walking on eggshells, that's where you want to be worried. Because if people feel like they have to be very careful when they're communicating and very, in some way, almost concerned that, oh my gosh, I don't want to say the wrong thing, then that's the opposite of a team that is noisy.
Well, I've been so into this conversation that I forgot to mention earlier to everyone, please do post your questions in the Q&A in the chat. We'll incorporate them, as we already have, in some of this discussion as we go. But this has been great so far, Matt. There's a couple of things that I want to sort of close the loop on. One is especially dear to our heart at the Global Business School Network, is that you and your co-authors spend quite a bit of time talking about global projects, right? Which when you think about the complexity, the technical complexity of many projects at NASA, and you add to that the cultural complexity of being global, it becomes even that much more interesting, as I would say. But you use as an example the International Space Station in the book, which is key. Tell us how, when you overlay the global dimension into this, what does that mean in terms of people skills, in terms of human skills and knowledge?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that global dimension to it, because what it means is you really have to be so much more intentional about relationship building. So for those of you who don't know much about the International Space Station, for 22 years now, people have been living off the Earth, 200 miles above us all, and they're just in orbit around us. And that's amazing when you think about it. People have been living off the Earth for 22 years consecutively. And they've been doing this in an institution, the International Space Station, that has international partners from a bunch of different countries. We've got people from the United States and Russia and Europe and Japan, Canada, and others. And it's remarkable. And part of what it shows us is that it took a long time to get there. And it was more than a decade of relationship building, trust building, and really true partnership before what we now think of as the International Space Station became this this fully lived-in vessel that's been orbiting the Earth with people on it for a couple decades. And that relationship building took things like people from NASA going to Russia and spending 6 months there at a time, getting to know their colleagues, people spending time with their Japanese colleagues, people spending time with their EU colleagues. And part of what's so interesting about this is that there are very different norms around communication. As we mentioned earlier, I'm a bit of a communications geek. This is my real interest here. And there are differences in how direct people are with each other. And I think that when you think about what the global dimension is, some cultures are very direct. When somebody feels like they want to say no, they say no. In other cultures, you would never do that. And you have to find ways to allow people to save face and say things in a way that is that's culturally and socially acceptable. And there are fundamental differences around the way we say things that will either seem to people that are appropriate or will leave people very upset. And understanding that and being able to speak the language, I don't mean the actual language, but in a way that you can be heard, is incredibly important in these kinds of projects. And I think that this is increasingly the way that so much of tech gets done these days, because everybody has an office in Shanghai and an office in Dubai, office in London, and an office in Singapore, and then they have one in San Francisco or New York. And that's people are basically dealing with this every day, and understanding that the way they talk to their counterparts in one office is going to be very different than the way they talk to counterparts in another office because of these cultural differences, I think is almost the coin of the realm these days. And I think that that's just the nature of things. We have colleagues in India and China, in Europe, in the Middle East, in the Americas. And there are norms around this, and we just have to learn them. I think it's incumbent on us to get used to this. A lot of it we pick up intuitively, and it's not just knowing what time zone we're in. It's also understanding how we can say things so our colleagues can hear us. And I think it's part of what makes things interesting in the global environment we find ourselves in today.
Yeah, definitely. And, examples like the International Space Station, when you think about today and the kinds of problems we need to solve, think about climate change. It's not something that's bounded by borders, right? It's something that's, if we're really going to make a difference, we have to think globally. We have to think about the complexity, the systems, and that means globally, right? So the kinds of challenges we need to solve today are those kinds of challenges that, I'm just amazed that they were able to start this work in the 80s before some of the technology that we see for communication, right? I mean, this is amazing. I want to, because of this idea that I think you mentioned that there was a lot of face-to-face work, right? And one of the big questions today in organizations is how much can we do online versus how much do we have to do or want to do in person? And, of course, we have all these great social networks, right? We can communicate with each other online in ways that we could never do before. But, I had a conversation with a professor named Henry Mintzberg not that long ago, and we had this conversation about community, right? So a network versus a community. And, which one's more powerful in some sense in getting the work done. Tell us about this face-to-face versus online dimension and how it relates to the human skills that we talk so often about during this conversation.
So I will admit to having a little bit of a bias here. I don't think there's any one answer. I think that the three of my co-authors and I are biased in believing that the in-person dimension matters. And that's not to say you can't do remarkable things virtually, but having opportunities to speak to people, to break bread with people, have meals with them and have a cup of coffee with them, or see them socially as well as at work does make a difference. And certainly the International Space Station experience absolutely validates this idea of how you break down some of those cultural barriers. Now, look, the last 3 years have been challenging for everyone in this respect, and we've come up with some remarkable ways to work together. And I know a bunch of all virtual organizations, so I'm a little bit on the fence about this one. I have to be honest. I think that we don't know the answer yet. I think that we're in a world where there will increasingly be all virtual organizations, and the jury's still out. We're going to collect some data and see what happens here. But I do think that if you can spend time with people in person, if both pandemics and logistics make it a possibility, that there's no substitute in this terms of the relationship building you can do. And that relationship building is what ultimately allows you to share that kind of tacit knowledge we discussed before in ways that are even more effective than if you're having to put an appointment on someone's calendar to have time with them on Zoom, or having to Slack them to say, hey, can we jump on the phone for a few minutes? Because there's an intentionality that virtual requires that is hard to overcome. Now, that said, the thing I like about virtual is we can communicate asynchronously, and you might be asleep when I'm doing my work and vice versa. And so we have tools that allow us to overcome that. And I think that's powerful too. One thing I am seeing people do occasionally is send each other videos as opposed to sending each other emails. So, or sending each other audio messages as opposed to emails, and getting a little bit of the tone in someone's voice, the expression on their face tells us a little bit more. It gives us some of that missing context. It can't do it all, but I actually think this is an interesting trend. And like I said, we're collecting data right now as a global business world, and we're going to see where we end up a few years from now as far as the all virtual versus the all IRL versus the hybrid.
Well, I have seen some of that data, and it's both encouraging and discouraging at the same time. One of the when you begin to dissect this, one of the questions relates to productivity, and another relates to innovation. Yeah. And the kind of relationships that facilitate productivity are the ones that, but it's your work group, right? There's a lot of redundancy in your connections. You learn, you have this tacit knowledge, and you're able to be productive. But the kind of relationships across those closely knit clusters of work groups, those interdisciplinary kinds of connections, those cross-cultural kinds of connections are the source of innovation. And if we don't continue to develop those, and they did diminish rather quickly in the context of COVID, then we may not get the innovation that we need in order to solve some of the problems that we need to. We've covered so much territory. I'm so excited, but I want to make sure I'm going to pause. We've addressed some of the questions that have popped up in the Q&A and the chat, but I want to ask you, Matt. We've covered a lot of territory, but there must be something you wanted to say coming in that I didn't give you the opportunity to say. And I want to give you this chance to talk about that.
Well, rather than just get up on my soapbox, let me tell you a story from the book that I think in some way epitomizes what the book's about. There was, at the beginning of the pandemic, a team of engineers at the Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech in California were wondering, what can we do about this? They saw that there was a global pandemic that was about to sweep the world, and they wanted to contribute in some way. And a senior leader there decided to put together a team that would help to address what was going to quickly be a worldwide shortage of ventilators. Now, ventilators are these breathing machines that were going to be needed to address this respiratory illness that was going to affect so many people. And these things are typically built with what are called medically certified parts, and the world was going to run out of medically certified parts. And so the question was, these engineers got it in their heads, could we design a new ventilator that could be built by anyone with parts that could be bought off the shelf? And these engineers who were generally rocket scientists, people who built Mars rovers, who knew nothing about medical devices, set this as a task. They had a 2-hour lecture by an expert in ventilators at a hospital in New York. And this team that had never worked before together, that was hand-selected but had never worked together, took this as their task in March 2020. 37 days later, they had a working design for a ventilator that they could share with the world that passed the United States Food and Drug Administration tests for a ventilator. And they shared these plans so that people in any country in the world, if they could get these off-the-shelf parts, could build these things. To me, that speaks to everything in this book. It's about collaboration, it's about learning, it's about knowledge, it's about culture, and ultimately, it's about how we get things done for a purpose. So in some way, to me, that story still inspires me, and it makes me think that's how this works. And it takes all of the qualities that the book's about, encapsulates them in one, I think, very compelling anecdote.
And the audience agrees. I guess I've seen the notes in that. And I agree. And I think it does crystallize what we've been talking about here, right? It's not just what that group, that team knew. It's not just their, I guess you call it the know what, right? Or it's not only their technical knowledge, but their ability to make this happen really relied on those things like storytelling, that collaboration, that culture that was built in order to again make this happen. So what a great story to end this conversation with, Matt. I want to thank you on behalf of not only the Global Business School Network, but Localized, and congratulate you on your book with Ed and Larry, and we wish you all the best. Thank you so much, Matt.
Oh, thank you so much, Dan. It's been a real pleasure talking to you and to the Localized community.
Great, thanks. Selma, great.
Yes.
There you
Thank you, Matt and Dan. That was quite a fruitful conversation. Matt, your insights were absolutely incredible. And Dan, your questions were so curious and in the sense of I was really taken aback by how much we could actually pull from NASA's findings and from industries that really apply to everything. So thank you, Dan, for pulling all of that out. And thank you everyone for being here. We appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Localized. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Matt. Take care.
Thank you.